I'd like to start off with a question. Let's imagine that we have some vulnerability, some weakness in our system. Maybe it's an application that's not written well, or a default configuration setting that allows just anybody to connect. So we have a known vulnerability, and there's an exploit that can be used to take advantage of that vulnerability or that weakness. What is the likelihood that it's actually going to happen? I mean, if there's never an attacker or a situation where there's an exploit that's actually used against the vulnerability, is it really a risk? So that's what I'd like to talk with you about in this video, is the concept of threats and also the actual risk involved regarding vulnerabilities and the exploits that take advantage of them. And a threat is anything that can exploit or take advantage of an existing weakness in our system. Now, this could be an intentional or unintentional taking advantage of, and that's what the threat is. Now, regarding who might use an exploit against the vulnerability, we have lots of possibilities for the actual threat themselves and the tools they're using. It could be a criminal, it could be a terrorist, it could be a hacker, it might be an employee that's disgruntled or an ex-employee that wants to get back at the company, or it could be a state-sponsored agent that's trying to compromise another state or logical entity. The attacker or hacker would likely be doing two basic things. Number one, discovering or becoming aware that the vulnerability exists. And then secondly, using a tool or a set of tools to compromise or take advantage of that vulnerability. And the end result of this is that the attacker is going to get, if it's successful, the attacker is going to have unauthorized access to the data or to the system, whether it's to change the data or manipulate the data or bring the system down. Is simply getting unauthorized access to our systems and data that the attacker should not have. So let's take a moment and take those three concepts, vulnerabilities, exploits, and threats, and let's vet them out. That's the first initial from each one, VET. The vulnerability is the weakness that exists in the system or in the software that provides possibilities of access by unauthorized individuals. Secondly, we have the exploit, which would be a way or a method that could be used by an individual or by an actor to compromise or take advantage of that vulnerability, ending in access that that attacker or unauthorized person should not have. And then the actual threat is the actual use of the exploit against the vulnerability. Our next question is really important, and that is, what is the probability? What is the likelihood that an attacker will, as a threat, use that exploit against our vulnerability? What are the chances of that happening? And that concept regarding the likelihood or the possibility of that exploit being used against the actual vulnerability, how probable is that? That has a term, and that term is called risk. So when we think about the word risk, I like us to think of it as the probability or the likelihood that the threat will exploit a vulnerability that's going to end up in causing loss or harm to our organization. And that last part of deciding the possibility or the potential for that actually happening is a critical factor, because if we're trying to protect an asset that's worth to the company $10 million, we're going to want to spend some resources in setting up countermeasures and preventions so that that vulnerability cannot be compromised by an exploit. On the other hand, if we have some asset or resource that costs $100 and we don't want to spend thousands and thousands of dollars in preventing and protecting that system, if the actual loss, if it actually got compromised, would only be $100. So here's the big picture. Companies really want to avoid risk. They don't want to get fines. They want to be able to continue to stay in business. They want to continue to make money and be productive. And risk is the likelihood that an exploit will be leveraged by an attacker or by a threat agent against a vulnerability. So as part of that, we'd want to identify where the vulnerabilities are, identify what the risk is as far as how much loss or damage would occur if there's an attack, and then put the appropriate countermeasures in place that can reduce the risk, because we're reducing the effectiveness of exploits against vulnerabilities. We'll take a separate look in a separate nugget regarding countermeasures to help protect against known vulnerabilities. So I'll see you in that video in just a moment. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.